Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to another Politics in the Pub event. We've been having them constantly through the year, it seems like. Today's event is we're talking about electrifying the line between at least Goulburn to Sydney, perhaps even onto Canberra, whether it's viable or not. I'd like to thank the speakers for turning up. We have Peter Grady. Hello, Pete, how you doing? We've got Greg Price. Everyone's seen Greg before. John Prokter, thank you. And Ben Moroney, thanks for coming down too. Okay, so before we start, I'd like to thank the Ngunnawal people and elders past and present for the meeting place that we're having today. And we have a form here, just a bit of housekeeping. We've got a petition for the TAFE Children's Centre. Everyone knows that they're trying to close the centre down and how important it is for some people to keep it open. So I'll pass this around, and if we can get a couple of signatures, that's great. If you don't want to fill it in, that's fine too. Okay, is that it? And I think, Alex, do you want to wait till the end? Okay, so Peter Grady, if you'd like to start it off.
Good evening. For you who don't know me, I'm Peter Grady, or Frederick Peter Grady. I've lived in Goulburn for 57 years. My railway credentials are, I joined the Railways, New South Wales Government Railways, in about October 56 as a clerk at Loco Goulburn, Loco Moree. That job cut out. I was put into the instrument grades in March 57, and the next 12 months I went from Moree, Narrabri, Wears Creek, Sydney, and finished in Goulburn, and I arrived here Anzac Day 1958, and I retired on the 22nd of May 1999, 41 years in Goulburn. I know a little about the railway in Goulburn. I certainly support your cause. I have no faith in it, as Greg knows and John knows. The line from Goulburn to Canberra is 105 kilometres, I think it is. 20 kilometres out of Goulburn is a place called Lake Bathurst, you all must know it. After Lake Bathurst to Canberra, there's not a straight piece of track anywhere. A black snake would get lost trying to follow it. As for electrifying it, I'm doubtful, very doubtful. Years ago, about 1990-something, I was secretary to the Railway Picnic. Katrina Hodgkinson was a local member. I picked her up on the train at Mossvale to go through to the picnic at Bungendore. She rode the engine from Goulburn to Bungendore, and one of the comments she made, when we get the power, we will straighten this line up. That was at least 30 years ago, and today the line is exactly the same. And go further than that, Sydney to Canberra, in my time of 57 years, has not done a thing. No government will support railway. Now the road to Canberra, it's a very hard job for a fireman at the time. Uphill 1 in 40 grades, down, up and down all night long. There was no consistency in it. Canberra, when you got there, was a disgraceful station for the capital of Australia. It had a sleeper platform, old sleepers put onto the platform. They renewed the station somewhere in the, 70s. The original one was west of the present one, and even the present railway station in Canberra, I consider it's a disgrace as our capital, Australian capital town. The depots in Canberra was very plain. You had a road coming off the loop down into what they call Loco. All Loco was a bit of a coal stage with some coal on it, very minimal. A 57 class tender there with diesel in it for the 900 classes, a water column, a tank, and the barracks over 100 yards away. When they done the yards up in the 70s, I reckon the barracks at Canberra looked funny. They were sitting on about a 10-foot mound of dirt. But eventually they tore it all down, build us new ones, and now they don't get used. I cannot see any government ever electrifying to Canberra or from Sydney, because electrification, as you might know, has gone back. Only a few years ago, electrification came out to Glenlee. Now they took it back to Macarthur. John and all the fellows here, I support them, but they will not put electrification. I cannot see it. They won't spend money on the railway. You've only got to see what they do for the trucking industries. Multiple freeways, they let them do whatever speed they like, as long as it doesn't go above 115. And they've done nothing for the railway. Good article in last week's Land. A National Party member going crook about all the money they're spending in Sydney in the light rail. $180 million a block. He said that would tar 900 kilometres of road. But they won't do the country. There's only Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. That is New South Wales. Nothing else counts, no matter who you talk to. When I come here, the line out to Canberra was steel sleepers. They took them out in mid-60s, they put wood in, and there's still only wood, and they will not... There's no freight go to Canberra, so they cannot get money. And you can't run a business without money. And as you all know, successive governments have got rid of the railways in New South Wales. I blame the Labor Party most of all. In 85 they come around and closed all the railway maintenance depots in New South Wales, with the exception of Werris Creek. What it meant was you couldn't run trains without maintenance. It was all given to the trucking industry. Then they sold the profitable coal lines off to their mates in big business, and now the people in New South Wales, country in New South Wales, all we're doing is paying taxes to pay for the metropolitan areas train services. And for Greg and to John, my best of wishes, but electrification will never happen to Canberra. No one will spend money on the railway. Thank you. Any questions?
We'll have the questions at the end.
Hey?
We'll have the questions at the end. We'll just let everyone have a speak, and we'll throw some questions to the audience after this. Okay. Thank you, Ben. If you'd like to have a go. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to again reiterate that this meeting tonight is happening on land that was never ceded by treaty or by contract. It is, was and will always remain Aboriginal land. That's actually an excellent introduction into the point that I want to make for tonight. Before I begin, I'm Ben Moroney. I'm the Greens candidate for the federal seat of Macarthur, which I know is not local exactly, but is actually adjacent. And we have some very similar issues in parts of Macarthur with railway electrification. As was said, the line stops at Macarthur, so it doesn't go down to Douglas Park, doesn't go down to Mossvale. So there's significant issues in the southern areas of Macarthur with electrification. And we're not talking about electrification. Let's just get that on the table. The issue is not just the concept of rail electrification. If it were that simple, it had been answered by now. It's a cost-benefit analysis. You sit down and you go, electrification makes maintenance cheaper, it makes people more likely to take the rail, it makes it lower emissions, all of these things, quieter, faster, you name it. But that's not what's on the table. And that's the problem we're having. The discussion isn't about electrification, the discussion is about nation building. The discussion is about a government having the foresight and the political will to invest money into something which may not bear returns for 30 years. But that doesn't matter, because it is the purpose of the government to be seeing further than that. But we've lost sight of that, and that's really the problem we're facing now, not just in rail electrification, but in telecommunications, in transport in general, in just any sort of major infrastructure project designed to deliver benefits to the community and not just for a balance sheet. And that's the trouble. That's what we've kind of run into nowadays. Before a project can begin, you need to have a corporate-style business case which sits down and lists in its entirety exactly how the money will be made back. You know, what sort of fees you're going to have to charge, what sort of taxes you're going to have to levy for it, and that sort of thing, with no concept of the actual benefits to the community, what we call externalities, which aren't reflected in the money that gets traded over it. We have a government now, honestly, successive governments, who are completely phobic of taking on debt in order to fuel new infrastructure. I mean, the argument's being had at the moment about the NBN, for example, and we've all heard the comparisons being made. If we'd had the same foresight back when we first put in telecommunication... if we had the same foresight back when we were first building roads in Sydney, as we do now, the Sydney Harbour Bridge would be 2 lanes. We're in a mentality now where everything is constrained by what corporate Australia will fund. We're in a mentality now where everything is constrained by who profits off it, by who gets to write the business case, who gets paid millions of dollars to write the business case, who gets to audit it, and who gets the donations and the political kickbacks once it's all said and done. We're in a situation now where we have governments that have no vision, or we have local members who are not listening to their communities. We have local members who are directed by their donors and directed by party apparatchiks and internal, decision making, and are completely disconnected from the people who put them into Canberra and put them into Macquarie Street in the first place. So what I'm trying to say is the discussion we're having tonight isn't just about electrification. I think what we need to keep in our minds is that the discussion that needs to be had is about making a case for infrastructure and making a case for investment into communities with a mind not for the 5-year payoff and not for the next quarterly report, but with a mind for the next 100 years of evolution of our society and, what sort of things that we could be needing that far in the future. It's not what we're talking about anymore. And frankly, we're setting ourselves up to fail very, very quickly. I mean, we're seeing it now already. We've got infrastructure that's crumbling. We've got bridges that are not being maintained that were built 100 years ago. And we've just decided, well, they're not worth it anymore. We don't get a payoff on this. We don't see where this falls in the balance sheet, so we're just going to cut back on that. We're going to cut back on fire brigades. How many fire brigades have closed across New South Wales in the last 10 years? You can't tell me that that is an investment in the safety of the community for the future. How many services are being shut? How many, basic things that people rely on are being closed up, boarded off, and centralised somewhere in the middle of Sydney? It's happening to us in Campbelltown right now. So, I know Campbelltown is obviously quote-unquote Sydney, but we've actually just had our RMS, our Roads and Maritime Services, closed and moved 40 minutes away. They said, this one centre can service the whole region. Because again, cost cutting, cutting staff, cutting the number of people who might be able to say, hey, this job's not going so well, I want to bargain for higher wages, I want to bargain for better conditions. Break that, because that's the sort of society we're living in now. The dollar just rules it all. I'm not going to go on any longer than that, really, and I think we'll leave it at the end for questions, but I just want to put that in everyone's minds as we're talking about this. This isn't a discussion about rail. This is a discussion about our future as a society. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, Greg Price. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. I don't quite agree with Ben. I think we are having a discussion about electrification. We've been having the discussion for quite some time, and John Prokter will speak after me and give you a rundown on where we're up to. I'll just go through sort of partly the technical bits. So I'll start off, why do we want electrification? Well, the Sydney to Canberra intercity railway line is the only intercity line out of Sydney which is not electrified. And alluding to what Ben said, it's time to bring this rail corridor into the 21st century. Electrification in conjunction with tilt train technology has the potential to significantly reduce travel times between Sydney and Canberra and stations in between. This corridor is the only area which hasn't had significant development adjacent to Sydney. And our corridor has the land and home prices which first home buyers in particular can afford to buy in. Councils along the Sydney to Canberra rail corridor are planning for an almost doubling of the population over the next 20 years. And added to this, there's about 400,000 people in Canberra. People like public transport. Electric trains support population growth. People are more likely to move to an area with good public transport. And if you have a look at the areas like the Central Coast, electrification and intercity passenger trains first went to the Central Coast in about 1960. When they first went to that area, the Central Coast was a collection of small towns and villages. Over the succeeding 55 years, the Central Coast now supports a population of about 350,000 people, I think it is. Didn't happen overnight, but it happened because people could get on a intercity train and travel to Sydney, and the Central Coast became a dormitory suburb of Sydney for people to go to work in. Now, I'm not saying that the whole of the South Line here will be a dormitory suburb for Sydney, but some of it would be, and with a proper electrification, it would certainly be possible for people to commute to Canberra for work rather than having to go to Sydney if you couldn't get work locally. Electric trains support population growth, and with the population growth comes economic growth. Business activity increases as population increases. And if you have a look in the Central Coast, down on the South Coast, even up around Newcastle, despite the government trying to, or having actually closed the line into Newcastle, businesses have flourished in those areas as the population increases and they're able to support the businesses as they go in. And there's no reason to believe that that wouldn't happen down this way. We believe the state government needs to be proactive on electrification and not wait until the region's population is bursting before reacting as they normally do. Normally what you find is an area starts to go ahead, and instead of getting ahead of the game, the government waits until they're so far behind they can almost never catch up again. We're saying that you need to take into account that this corridor is going to develop and develop fairly rapidly over the next 20 years, and the government needs to get ahead of the game and have the electrification in place. And that will, if that happens, that will make the area more attractive for people to come and move into. The benefits of electrification with tilt train technology are quite good. Some benefits are faster travel times between Sydney and Canberra and the intervening stations. As an example, a tilt train travelling between Sydney and Canberra will do the trip in 3 hours instead of 4. Goulburn to Sydney in 2 hours instead of 3. Electric tilt trains are quieter than diesel trains. Electric trains will be more comfortable, particularly in relation to the Endeavour diesel trains. Anybody who's travelled on an Endeavour diesel train will know that sitting on one of those seats is like sitting on a rock, not to mention the fact that you're squeezed up if more than 2 people want to sit on the 3 seats. Electric trains are more reliable, and as the minimum train length would be 4 cars, they will have greater passenger capacity than the current diesel trains. Trainlink, the old Country Link, doesn't have enough diesel trains to improve current service levels. With new tilt trains, we would expect more frequent services to be provided. Trainlink is severely limited by the number of Endeavour train sets that they have. They are in the process with the government and Transport for New South Wales in laying down the specifications for the replacements for the XPTs between Sydney, Melbourne and Dubbo, and the Explorer and Endeavour trains. But when I last spoke to Ian Mondon, who's the Regional Service Delivery Manager here, he told me that the projection for the new trains to come online was 2025. We're hoping it'll be a bit earlier, but 2025 is far too far away. Now, the other thing about electric trains is that they're more climate friendly. And one of the things that was asked at a recent combined councils meeting that Strug was invited to attend from Queanbeyan Council was, can electric trains run on renewable energy? And the answer is, of course they can. The train doesn't care where the power comes from as long as there's the right voltage and you've got the right amperage. So what's the deal with tilt trains? Ordinary intercity electric trains have the capacity to be more comfortable, quieter and faster service than the current diesel trains between Sydney and Canberra. But only tilt trains have the capability to significantly reduce travel times between Sydney and Canberra. Ordinary trains can go faster through the curves than they are allowed to, but the problem is that if you go faster through the curves, the passenger's comfort is significantly degraded. The faster they go through the curve, the rougher the ride. And if you're standing up, you'll get knocked off your feet, or you can be thrown against the wall or other passengers if you're seated. Tilt trains can smooth this out in two ways. Firstly, they have what they call steerable bogies. And these bogies allow the axles to move slightly backwards and forwards with the wheel. And allowing the wheel to turn allows the train to traverse the curves more easily and smoothly. The flexibility allows the train to travel faster than a normal rigid bogie through the curves. Secondly, as the name implies, the body of the carriage tilts to smooth the ride for passengers inside the train. In fact, the only way a passenger can tell if the train is in tilt mode is to watch the bottom ledge of the window. If the train is tilting, you will see the window ledge rising or falling against the background scenery. In the early 1970s, when this technology was being developed, the British trialled a 16-degree tilt, and the passengers literally became seasick. So today the body tilts to a maximum of 8 degrees, and this is about the maximum tilt that remains undetected by passengers. The combination of steerable bogies and tilting bogies enable these trains to travel significantly faster through curves, and this is how these trains would reduce our travelling times on this line. On the normal straight sections of track, these trains would be restricted to basically the same speed as the ordinary trains, non-tilting trains, but they'll make up their time running through the curves at significantly faster speeds. And as an example, when the Swedish tilt train was here in 1995, I was lucky enough to have a trip on it. And we got to ask the Swedish engineer, no relation to the Swedish chef, what speed they would run this train over the Picton to Mittagong section of the line if it was in Sweden. Now, anyone familiar with this section of the line would know that basically it's all curves. There's only a few short straight sections, and depending on whether you're coming or going to Sydney, it's either uphill or downhill. The maximum speed for our current trains is 80 kilometres an hour. And after giving the question some thought, he replied that if the line was in Sweden, they would run the tilt train at 105 kilometres an hour over that section. So that's something like 27% faster than what we can currently do it. It is ironic that New South Wales trialled the tilt train technology in Australia in 1995, and the Queensland government was the only one to recognise the benefits of the tilt train, and they are currently the only rail system in Australia running them at the moment. And this is despite wide use of this technology in Europe and Britain. What are we asking the government to do? Well, Strug is asking the New South Wales state government to electrify the current line between Sydney and Canberra. There is an incorrect belief in the government, which we've had a hell of a fight with Prue over, that electrification would require the railway line to be rerouted, and this option would be very expensive. At a meeting that we had with Andrew Constance back in September, when we got to electrification, that was the first thing he said. Oh, we'd have to build new track and new stations, new signalling, everything. He said it cost $10 billion, we can't afford it. Electrification of the current line is a much more cost-effective proposal. What is overlooked by the government is that even if they build a new line, the current line would still need to be electrified, as the towns and villages are centred around this line. I've seen maps of where they've proposed new lines, and if they actually built those lines, they are well away from most of the current population base. So you still have to electrify the current line in order to service the population that's in there now. Electrification with tilt trains would make Moss Vale about midway between Sydney and Canberra, and this would make it practical for people to commute to Sydney or Canberra for work. So what does electrification entail? The main component is the poles and wires along the length of the line. This will be the most expensive component. Next, we need the electricity substations to power the wires, and multiple substations would be needed. Finally, the tunnels along the line will need to be adjusted for clearances for tilt trains. The total trackage to be electrified is approximately 448 kilometres. Strug believes that electrification of the current line can be achieved for plus or minus $2 billion. The ACT or federal government may want to extend the line into Canberra if electrification goes ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Our last speaker for the night is John Prokter.
Good evening, everybody. I haven't been in Goulburn as long as Peter. I've only been here just on 30 years, but I love the place. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Strug tonight, which is the Southern Tablelands Rail Users Group. We've been in existence now for about 2 years, and we formed, or the need for our group grew out of the timetable changes in 2013 when two of our very early morning services were put back, and it really did upset the people that use those services. And we've been, part of our aim is to try and improve them and get them back towards the original times before they were changed. We generally represent all rail users south of Moss Vale. For rail users north of Moss Vale, that was represented by Shrug, which is the Southern Highlands Rail Users Group. Now, they don't seem to be around anymore because they achieved what they wanted to do in 2013 when they took a number of our trains away from us. They have about an hourly service up there throughout the whole day now. Strug is now an incorporated association with about 25 members. We are actively seeking improvements to rail services in the Southern Tablelands, especially south of Moss Vale. We're doing that in three areas. One is our local services, formerly City Rail, now Trainlink. The second one is what we're talking about tonight, the electrification between Sydney and Canberra, and also the provision of tilt trains. It is a must that those two things come together, not one or the other. And our third strand, which we're looking at, is eventually the VFT. Probably won't service all the communities. It can't, because it's got to get up to a fast speed, and once it gets there, it's got to stay there. So at this stage, there's only talk about one station between Canberra and Sydney, which would be around about Moss Vale somewhere. It's not Goulburn at this stage. Okay, we've had 2 meetings with the New South Wales Transport Minister since we formed. Our first one was with Gladys Berejiklian when she was in the role about 12 months ago, and more recently in September we have had a meeting with Andrew Constance. We have frequent meetings with members of the local seats and local members, Jai Rao for Wallandilly. We've got a meeting with him next week, Prue Gowd for Goulburn, and John Barilaro for Monaro. We also have regular contact with Goulburn Marlborough Council, our Mayor Jeff Kettle and General Manager Warwick Bennett. Goulburn Marlborough Council have been very supportive of our Strug and our aims. They have had a representative at most of our meetings, if not all. They have made representations to the Canberra Region Joint Organisation of Councils, and from that RJO, there was a letter to the New South Wales Government supporting electrification of the Sydney and Canberra corridor. There was also a recent meeting at Goulburn Mulwaree Council between the corridor councils and Strug. The councils were talking about along the corridor of Wingecarribee, Goulburn Mulwaree, Pallarang, Queanbeyan, and unfortunately a late withdrawal was Wallandilly. But they were all supportive, asked a lot of questions about what we were trying to do, why we were trying to do it, and they have resolved to seek funding for a feasibility study to demonstrate the viability of the electrification project and also to establish a focus group. Finally, I might mention that Strug has had going for about 4 or 5 months now a letter campaign in support of electrification, and we have over 700 letters we've got so far, and we're keeping that rolling. I thought I would mention, Greg just spoke to me during the meeting about the population along the corridor. Prue did mention in a meeting in December last year that we needed a population of 100,000 to support electrification of the corridor. At Strug we've done the numbers and we've come up with a population of 150,000 along the corridor, and that ignores the ACT, which has around 400,000. So definitely it is viable in relation to the population. What we need to do now is get somebody to give us a very good estimate, put the numbers together, give us a cost-benefit case, and we'll put that to the government, and then we really can put the screws down on them. Thank you.
That's a troublemaker. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, guys. Right, now I'm going to pass the mic around. We're not going to film the crowd tonight, sorry. Sorry? I'm just going to pass the microphone. If you'd like to ask a question to our speakers, they will give you. So who's first? Okay, Leslie.
Thanks. Well, we've got overwhelming evidence that electrification would be a plus for the nation, a plus for this area. Why isn't it happening? Well, maybe it's money. Well, all right, are we short of money? But, you know, we're spending a lot of money on submarines and warships and bombers and you name it, you know. If it's got to do with war, that's good business. And so, is that why? Anyhow, so oil. Well, Middle East was always awash with oil. Is that good for the Middle East? What's happening there? And there's a great big hole planned for the middle of Queensland to mine coal. Right? Excellent. So the government thinks. A lot of farmers don't. Anyhow, so what are we going to do about that? Maybe we should have a look at the interests of people in government. Do we have a proper, where people have to put down a list of businesses they have interests in, and then when it comes to discussing anything to do with that, they should excuse themselves and go out, I think. How do you feel about that?
Well, you're right, and they do have a list of their interests, and you're right, they are supposed to excuse themselves. Prior to Malcolm Turnbull taking over as Prime Minister, under Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, there was no federal money available for passenger rail projects. with Malcolm Turnbull taking over, he is pro-public transport, and he has already funded a number of public transport projects, a couple in Melbourne, the Melbourne Metro, something in Brisbane, I think that's a tram one, and there's one or two others. So we are in a better position now. The New South Wales government is in possession, or will be shortly, of a lot more funds than what they let on. We, as Strug, are asking the government to fund the electrification of the line between Sydney and Canberra in their 2017 and 2018 budgets, and we believe that this is well within their capabilities, and we will continue to press for that. You're right about the government interests. There is no city or no country in the world that is closing a heavy rail link into the middle of a city, a major city. And yet this government has closed the heavy rail link into Newcastle because the developers up there want to build multi-storey luxury accommodation on the rail corridor so they can have the best views of Newcastle Harbour. So there's got to be a lot of questions asked there. Unfortunately, they succeeded in closing the line. They did it through legislation with the Shooters and Fishers Party. A lot of what they're saying is going to be done as part of that, which includes the construction of a tramway. I don't think they're ever going to see that tramway, but that's my opinion. And I also believe that rather than reinvigorating the Newcastle metropolitan area and CBD, as they say, it's going to kill it off. But that's something that we're going to have to wait and see. But certainly it's within the government's financial capabilities to pay for the electrification between Sydney and Canberra, and with the advent of the Turnbull government, it is almost certain that the New South Wales state government won't have to bear the full responsibility on its own. So in that regard, I'm quite hopeful.
I mean, look, you know what you're going to get out of me about government interests. It's absolutely true. We have a situation right now where the shots are being called by the wealthy, and it's simple as that. The Greens have been consistently pushing for a federal level independent commission against corruption, which would investigate these sorts of pecuniary interests and issues where money is changing hands for decisions, as has been the case in New South Wales for a very long time until the New South Wales ICAC was instituted. Obviously it hasn't fixed everything, but it certainly goes some way. As well as that, we've also been pushing for significant restrictions and caps on donations to political parties and federal MPs, similar to what we've been pushing for at a New South Wales level. Ultimately, the thing is, Australia is not a poor nation. We like to talk about crying poor with what we've got at the moment, or we're in so much debt, that sort of thing. But we have $12 billion, $24 billion if you include the maintenance, to spend on joint strike fighters from the United States that can't fly. We have $12 billion a year to spend on subsidies to fossil fuel companies. We have the money to build the infrastructure for the Watermark coal mine being placed in the middle of the best black soil plains in New South Wales, in the Liverpool Plains, destroying our food bowl, but we can fund the rail lines, oddly enough, that will go in and take the coal from there. There's plenty of money around for people who are in the position to ask for it. And what we really need is we need voices in Parliament, we need voices on the streets, we need voices in our communities that are standing up to say that money is no longer just going to be for the big end of town, that money is going to be for us.
Okay, ask for more questions. Hello, how you doing?
When will it be Green Party policy to put electrification between Sydney and Canberra through Goulburn?
We don't have a specific policy about electrifying that line. However, our policy is that ultimately, as part of a transition to a renewable energy economy in Australia, all rail would be electrified. So I can say right now that electrifying this rail line is certainly within the remit of our policy. And I have to say, if Greens in this area are elevated in any way to a position of influence, that is something we'll be taking directly to anyone we can find. A date on that? Unfortunately, I couldn't give you a date on that. That's up to the voters. It's not up to us. I would be absolutely thrilled. But ultimately, that's up to the community. It's not up to us. We can only do as much as the voters give us the ability to do. I will do that. I'm actually the policy coordinator for New South Wales, so I can work on that.
Okay, more questions? Come on, Shirley. You're all in agreement. I love that sort of stuff. Hello, thank you.
I'll save you. Look, I actually live in Mittagong, and I'm very disappointed that they've reduced the rail services for people here. I'd like to see people from Mittagong join in with the local people here and get on board for the whole, corridor. Yeah. So I'd just like to know, how people in Mittagong can work with you. And I know there's a new environmental group called ECOS in Mittagong, which is ecological and sustainable development. So maybe we can sort of introduce it through there and see where we can go from there.
Yeah, that would be most welcome. We were going to have to go down that way anyway. One of the things that would help is if you could get the form letter for asking the state government to electrify the line between Sydney and Canberra. We've done that mostly around Goulburn so far, but we do intend to move up and down the line. And so if your organisation was prepared to help us with that, that would be a big help. You can also get on to your local state member, Jai Rowell. Jai, by the way, is actually very, very supportive of electrification. So if you go and talk to Jai, he's not going to push you off or push you away. He's going to be quite on your side. Well, it depends on what day of the year it is and who she's been talking to. One minute she's on our side, and then after we had our meeting with Andrew Constance in September, and he said, we'd have to reroute the line and that would cost $10 billion. She flipped over to his side because that was her position originally. And it took us forever to convince her that you don't have to reroute the line and you can do it much more cheaply. And I believe that she's been quoting figures much higher than $10 billion since. So you never know where you are with her. 1 minute she's on your side and the next she's swapped over. So as with all politicians, you have to keep on them. We try to have regular meetings with the politicians along the line, and in fact on the 25th of this month we have a meeting with Jai Rowell, and we're trying to get another meeting with John Barilaro, which is proving to be problematic. His office seems to be totally chaotic. For the third time today, I had to put in a request through emails for a meeting with him because they don't seem to have any record of the two other requests that I put in. So one of the excuses was, he's been off for a couple of months and he's been bonding with his new baby daughter. And I thought to myself, well, I don't remember when I had my kids, if I had any, that I got 2 months off to bond with the baby. So being a politician seems to give you some pretty decent lurks and perks, apparently. But yeah, if we could talk to you afterwards, and we'd be happy to pass on some letters to you later. And if your group could chase up Jai as well as us, that would be very helpful and most appreciated.
Yeah, sorry about that. Normally we send invitations out to the politicians, but... oh, you did? Yeah, I gave up ages ago. But, yeah. Yep. Oh, sweet. Yeah, because honestly, I just give up. It doesn't take a lot for me to give up on things. I get sick of the automated responses. Okay.
Prue can't run away from us quick enough.
So I was at the Strug meeting just before the last state election, and it seemed to me like there was a lot of talking by Prue and not a lot of commitment. And what struck out at me is that there was no real vision there. Like there's no vision as to how we're going to move forward or what the 20, 30, 50-year plan is. It seems like the vision has crept back to be a 4-year cycle. And it's a little bit cynical, but it almost appears like politicians are only worried about their re-election. What's the vision? How can we sell the vision? How can we get our politicians to have a vision so we can move forward? And not just for us, but for future generations. Because when you're building infrastructure, ultimately you're spending a lot of money and it needs to last more than one generation.
You're right. Long-term planning for a politician, whether it's state or federal, is the next election. And I don't actually know how you can get them to look past that. We've certainly tried with Prue, and you're right, Prue doesn't seem to have any long-term plan. What I can say is that during the last state election, Strug was able to make electrification and public transport a big issue with Prue in the electorate. And since the election, the state election, where Prue got the fright of her life, because she wasn't that far away from being defeated, unfortunately it seems to me that Prue has the attitude that I'm a Liberal and I'm born to rule. She wasn't expecting to have such a big backlash against her. And she did actually climb on board for a long time. It was only since the last meeting that we had with Andrew Cowan that she started to flip-flop again. And I don't know, I mean, Gyral is, as far as a politician is concerned, at least on electrification, is good. He knows the benefits of it. He wants to see it happen, and he's been agitating for it for many years, long before we ever started, along with the Wallandilly Shire Council. So he does have a long-term vision. Prue, don't know that she has a vision at all, and I can't determine whether John Barilaro's got a vision or not. The only meeting we had with him, when we left, he said, "Oh, look, I'm pretty sure I'm going to support you." I rang his office about a month or 6 weeks later because I hadn't heard anything back, and we were going to a meeting. I think it was with Prue, and I needed to know whether he was on board or not, because I needed to tell Prue, well, look, these people are on board. And I didn't get to talk to John, but I got a message back that said yes, he was on board, and he was going to talk to, arrange for a meeting with Prue to talk about electrification. To the best of my knowledge, even asking at Prue's office, John hasn't spoken to her yet. I'm having trouble trying to get into to see him and have a meeting with him again. I'm going to be very keen, and we've got some very searching questions that we want to ask him about where he stands and what he's done, what he proposes to do. But politicians don't have a vision past the next election, whether it's state or federal, and I don't know how you manage to fire them up. I don't know, maybe Ben has, or John Prokter even, but I can't tell you, unfortunately.
I'm not going to keep you too long because I feel filthy doing this sort of spiel, but the only way you can really make a politician think about the future is to threaten them. Unfortunately, it's as simple as that. We've got politicians that have safe seats, and safe seats are the scourge of politics, frankly. The only way, I mean, that's what we think. The way we keep them honest is to replace them. But that's for the community to decide, and that's for people to, people to stand up, people to say, this is an issue this election, and if you don't do it, it will change your future. That's, I think, it's in the system that we're given, in the way it currently operates. That's unfortunately sometimes the only way to get things done in Parliament.
I was speaking to a bloke only a couple of days ago, John Edwards, a couple of fellas here know him. John holds some local position in QBE. He told me they're just about to double the increase of the waste out of Sydney and control, and the government has told them it doesn't about delaying the passenger trains. The goods trains must have priority. But I'll go back to my first argument. A couple of blokes here can tell you the track out to Canberra, it needs completely rebuilt, and no government will spend $100 million on 100 kilometres of track.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's it.
Hello.
We seem to spend a lot of time apologising for the government and worrying about where they're going to get the funds and whether they've got the will, when we should just be saying to them, this is what we'd like to do because the trains are important to us as a community, please get on with the job. We keep saying the track's too windy, this is going to cost too much, this is going to take too long, and we are defeatist if we keep doing it. When are we going to start saying to them, we want it, would you please provide it?
Whatever the government is going to support the trucking industry, the government is not responsible for a thing. There's no minister responsible for a track accident. They just blame that the driver done something wrong. We've got a highway to Canberra to Sydney for Murray's coaches. They're running almost 24 hours a day. The government wouldn't even look at competing with them. And if they bring in the extra waste from Sydney, there'll be no reliable service from Country Link in Canberra.
Yeah, I think we really need to give the politicians a good kick up the backside. They're not listening to us. They don't have any vision for the future. Their vision is for 4 years. We really need some politicians that are thinking about building Australia for the next 50 years or 100 years. Where would we be now without the Snowy Mountain scheme? Are we ever going to see another Snowy Mountain scheme? Probably not. All they seem to want to do is keep building a three-way that goes from one congested intersection to the next congested intersection. And it's mainly in Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong. They don't seem to really worry about our regional areas. Well, as Ben said earlier, maybe we've got to toss them out once in a while so they think, well, if I don't do my job properly, I'm not going to be here. Thanks.
Oh, Pete.
Along the lines of the benefits of electrification, at the moment it's all skewed towards Sydney. The further you go, the fewer the services, and the more inconvenient the times those services run. Electrification all the way through to Canberra will level that out. It is 20 times easier for someone in Mittagong to go to Sydney than it is to go to Canberra. It's the same distance, but the services just diminish. And spreading that economic benefit right through the region, rather than as it is, it slowly peters away. The further you go, the worse it gets. And the other issue is the privatisation of the line and the maintenance. A lot of the line has speed restrictions on it, and it seems no sooner do they fix one area that another area goes and has speed restrictions placed on it. It seems inconceivable that we're putting first an XBT years ago and now talking about tilt train technology these new trains onto tracks that haven't changed for over 100 years. Instead of when an area gets damaged and there's speed restrictions, they work on it, they relay the track in exactly the same place with exactly the same curves. Would it not be better to be pushing for those areas to be improved, straightened, realigned as that work goes on? It's like the highway. I grew up in Cootamundra, and to go to Sydney along the highway 30 years ago was an all-day trip. Yep. Now it's a proper highway and it takes 4 to 5 hours because the work was done gradually, over time, and if the same process was used on rail, gradually improving it, straightening it out over time, we'd eventually have tracks where these trains would be able to run quickly and efficiently on.
Yes, you're right. On the first bit, if electrification went through, we would envisage an hourly service out of Canberra, between Canberra and Sydney, and there may be scope for a half-hourly service out of Goulburn or even Moss Vale. And that would make it much easier for people to, and more convenient for people to travel between Mittagong or Moss Vale, Goulburn and Canberra. And with the current main line, the original plan and idea for the ARTC, the Australian Rail Track Corporation, was that they were going to do exactly what you say. They were going to straighten the line out, reduce the grades, make the trip a lot faster. The problem came up was that the government wouldn't fund them. Now the ARTC is allowed to borrow money, but they have to borrow it at commercial rates and they have to be able to repay it. And unfortunately, the only piece of ARTC track in the country that makes any money is in the Hunter Valley with all the coal trains. They just barely cover their costs with the rest. Unless state and federal governments are prepared to tip the money into the till to say, right, we're going to do this, we're going to straighten the line out, we're going to reduce the grades, it just can't happen because the ARTC doesn't have the ability to do it. Part of the reasons why that you have so much problem with the track now, in New South Wales at least, after they took over, the section basically from Moss Vale, I think it was, somewhere around there, down to the Victorian border was still mostly wooden sleepers. The ARTC management decided that they were going to replace the sleepers with concrete sleepers, which was nice, but when you replace or when you're going to lay concrete sleepers, what you have to do is you have to take the track out, the old track out, you have to clean all the ballast, the mud, everything away, and they lay a special felt down that doesn't rot or takes a long time to rot. They say it doesn't rot, I say it takes a long time to rot. And then they lay the new track bed and the ballast over the top of that. They didn't have the money to do that, so they decided they were going to do what they call side insertion, and that means that they take the sleeper out the side, the old one, and they slide a new one in. But when you do that, you do what they call breaking the cap, and that's the layer under there that keeps the mud down. And ARTC management was told, don't do this, this will cause more problems than it's worth. And because the people that were managing the ARTC didn't have rail experience and didn't listen to the people who they should have, they said, no, we've only got the money to do it this way, so you go ahead and do it that way. And so we've been suffering the results of that ever since. I think that if you look at the lease agreement that the ARTC originally got from the New South Wales government, they're in breach of that agreement on a regular basis, just in far as trying to keep the trains on time, the percentage of trains on time that they're required to have. The only way that they're really going to fix it is either, like you said, to build a new track, which would be desirable but out of their cost abilities, or to start gradually cutting back and doing the job properly as they should have done in the first place. So there's no easy way out of it, unfortunately.
Public entity which actually has to compete for funding from the government. But more importantly than that, it either has to corporatise whatever it has currently or abrogate its responsibilities. And like we said earlier, if you can take what was something that you had to be responsible for and you had to maintain and you had to worry about the people, and if a train goes off the tracks, it's the government's fault. And no one would argue that, and it is, and it's something that should be, fixed. But if a car goes off the road, that's not the government's fault. If a truck goes off the road, that's not the government's fault. If the trucking corporations bust down the pay of people driving trucks, that's not the government's problem. But if the rail workers' pay is slashed, that is the government's fault, and that's something they take political heat for, and so they well should. It's basically a method of transferring what should be the service responsibilities of the state onto private companies and onto the individual. It's this creation of a neoliberal individualist society where there's no collective responsibility for anything anymore, and that's how the bureaucrats like it.
True.
No worries, Laszlo, if you can keep it tight.
One matter of the growth of industry, which is inevitable. It's happening, and we have more and more freight trains going on the lines, which makes it almost impossible for the passenger trains to go there. What's the answer? Well, build another line for passenger trains. Build it so that it becomes efficient and gets a lot of customers, right? But we must think of the future. As you said, it's building the nation, news nation.
Thanks, Laszlo. Greg?
The idea of building another line is a good idea, but one of the problems is when you have a look at the maps of where they want to put the lines, the lines would take away. Oh, underground. Ooh, that's expensive. That's expensive. We can't even get them to build them above ground. I will make one quick comment. I don't know. Ben just reminded me of it with the corporatisation and privatisation of the passenger rail system. I don't know if any of you have seen the town and country section in today's Goulburn Post. If you go to page 5, you'll find an advertisement calling for tenders for administration of country link ticketing and other services through New South Wales. So this is another case or another piece of privatisation by stealth, like the Opal card. Won't be long before there'll be nobody on Goulburn Station.
I know. Is it on? Sorry. Is it on? Yep. Okay, there we go. It's definitely on. I know I'm a troublemaker, but part of me really wonders, why are politicians allowed to drive from Sydney to Canberra? They should have to take the public train. I can understand an argument for flights and emergencies, but why are they driving it at all? The other thing, I mean, I'm American, you can hear that in my voice. Our Amtrak systems are completely falling to, I'll say junk because it's a more polite word. Amtrak's slowly falling apart. The only advantage Amtrak has over New South Wales Rail, from what I can see, is that at least when it was originally invested in, there were more cities along the way, so it had to have more infrastructure originally. There's just more second and third tier cities. It's not just New York and DC and places that were ignored. New South Wales, it seems to me, never invested properly in places like Goulburn. It barely invested in Newcastle, and as you can see, it's eating Newcastle now. How can we, and I'm not from here and I'm not trying to, I don't know, how can we invest in Goulburn and really build up places that aren't Sydney-centric? Like, I don't mind Sydney, I like Sydney, Sydney's really beautiful, but it's not even good for Sydney for it to be the only city in New South Wales. It's not even healthy for Sydney, much less healthy for places like Goulburn.
Yeah, with Amtrak, they had significant investments and they were required to service a lot of places that weren't large cities, as you said. One of the advantages that they have, even though the system's, as you say, falling apart, it's not quite, but it has its problems. But because of the population base of America, you can carry a lot more people. And that has a big impact on what you can do. You're right, but actually most politicians don't drive from Sydney to Canberra, they fly from Sydney to Canberra. And yeah, that's right. They look out the plane and think, oh, that looks awful. But one of the advantages that come out of running tilt trains, the former head of the Australian Railroad Association told us that if we could get a train to run between Sydney and Newcastle and the other way in 3 hours or less, we will take a large chunk of the airline passengers. Because to fly from Canberra to Sydney, you're going to take 3 hours. You've got to book in early, you've got to put your luggage in, then you've got to wait to get on the plane and all that sort of stuff. You can get on a train, do it in 3 hours, and if they do their specifications for the train right, they should have PowerPoints all through the train so business people can do their work on their laptops and parents can keep their screaming kids happy to watch movies or play games on their computers. But you're right, the politicians should be made to use the rail system more often, and that would certainly help to get the message across that this isn't good and you need to do something about it. But unfortunately, they get gold passes and we all pay for them to travel first class on airlines, and they're not going to give that up easily. There's one thing you know about politicians, they'll take all the lurks and perks under the sun, they don't want to give anything back. But yeah, look, Amtrak does have the advantage that they've got a much bigger population base to work with than we do. But electrification of the line between Sydney and Canberra would certainly give Goulburn and the Southern Highlands an opportunity to have major expansions of population and business and make it a much more prosperous area. And to their credit, the Goulburn-Mulwaree Council is keen to promote more population growth in the area and to bring business in. And they're always working to bring business in wherever they can. We may not always like the businesses they want to bring in, but at least they're working to do it. So that's something. But electrification would go a long way towards improving not just for Goulburn either, but the whole corridor. And it will also benefit Canberra. 3 trains a day of 3 carriages is not a world-class service.
I'm not going to pretend this is a Greens policy, this is just personally what I believe, but I think that if you're an MP who represents anywhere in the Sydney Metro, Comcars should be scrapped. They'll pay for a train ticket from your station to Canberra. That's it. We do try and push for a reduction of perks, but I maybe go a little bit further than some. I also don't think politicians should be able to use private healthcare, but that's another thing entirely. The thing is, I guarantee you that if you instituted that and you made politicians take the train from Central to Canberra to get to Parliament, you'd see the line electrify the next week.
Yeah, I think it really is a silly situation where we're saying, well, there's not enough population to support the trains to electrify the line, so we won't electrify the line. If they electrify the line, we'll get the population. Most of the councils along this corridor are forecasting doubling of their population in the next 20 years, 30 years. It's going to happen, and then we're going to be trying to backfit or retrofit electrification and improve train services. It just does not make sense. It was mentioned earlier about realigning the tracks, providing additional tracks. We see that as being gold plating at this stage. It will be necessary in the future, but we'd rather get the electric trains running now on what we've got and then improve the stations, realign the tracks in the future when the services do need it. And that can be done in small sections. We're talking about a $2 billion project. We don't want it to become a $20 billion project or a $200 billion project because the cost-benefit ratios are not going to stack up. We've got to try and, at this stage, keep the project as simple and cheap as possible to get the politicians convinced that it can go through with what they've got. They don't have to borrow $10, $20, $30 billion and to get everybody on board. We're just going to have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. It's not going to do it by itself. We've just got to keep being a burr in their saddle, so to speak.
I was just thinking, we're looking to New South Wales and also Sydney a lot, right? We should also be looking to ACT, which is more progressive parliament, more progressive ideology, and also to companies that look to the future like Tesla and other things like that, right? I mean, I'm just wondering, is there a case where, we could go to someone like Tesla and say, look, you electrify that line between Goulburn and Canberra and take it then all the way to Sydney, and all this sort of business, Is that part of it, to take it to past the neoliberal benchmark and actually play their game and actually get something done? I just wonder what the panel thinks of that.
I'm always leery of farming out any public service to a private company. I mean, look, the thing is, if that becomes the only option, maybe at some point that's something that should be considered. I think that ultimately would just be wallpapering over the ultimate issue, which is not that we don't have the money or not that we don't have the expertise, that sort of thing, just we don't have the political will to do it. That politicians are too tied up in interests and too tied up in donors and too willing to just continue going along with what's currently working. I mean, the Greens do not support any privatisation of any part of the rail service or any payment to private companies to tender. So I'm not going to sit here and say the Greens would support that. If that's something that happens in the future and that's the only option, it could be possible, but it's not part of our policy.
My problem is that most of the companies, and Tesla would be one of them, really don't have any technology that would assist us at the moment. Doesn't mean that they won't in the future, but you need to take into account that a train is a very heavy object. If you tried to run it on battery power, for argument's sake, and there are actually a couple of trains in England that they're trialling on battery power, they have very limited capabilities. They can only do about 12 to 20 miles, and then they need a recharge, so they have to carry a motor to recharge them and run the train in the meantime. It could be in the future that a company could develop some technology and come to the government and say, look, we've got this and we'd like to trial it, or we can give you a good price on it. And then it goes back to what Ben says, political will. And political will in this state at least is a bit wishy-washy. Unless you're one of their favourite donors or somebody, you're probably not likely to be welcomed with open arms immediately, at least. But if your technology is good enough and you keep persisting with the bureaucracy, you might get in. But the government itself and the government ministers, I think you really need to be a big party donor before they're going to start listening too much to you. Privatisation, when Barry O'Farrell was elected, or prior to Barry O'Farrell getting elected in 2011, he said at the time that he would not privatise the railway, the passenger rail system in the first term of government, but he'd take it as a policy to the next election. Now, Barry didn't get to go to the next election, Mike did, and Mike didn't actually take that as a policy. But if you have a look at what he's been doing, basically everything he's been doing over recent years has been designed to prepare the Sydney trains and Trainlink for privatisation. That advertisement today that I just mentioned in the local Town and Country for the tenders to take over the Trainlink ticketing and functions that are currently performed by Trainlink staff, that is another step in the privatisation program, but it's privatisation by stealth. They're not telling you that that's what they're up to, they're just doing it quietly and hoping you don't notice. And if anyone saw the news this evening, there was a big thing about the new North West Rail Link's going to have 6 new stations at Crow's Nest and Barangaroo and Martin Place and a couple of other places. And they mentioned that the end of the line is now, they're now looking at, instead of terminating the North West Rail Link at Bankstown, they're looking at running it through to Liverpool. So basically, what I couldn't see on the map that they showed, and I'm going to have to read a bit about it in coming days, if they're going to try and use the current rail line, above ground rail lines in Sydney that lead out to Liverpool, that's going to almost totally destroy Sydney Trains timetabling. You cannot mix a manned train with driverless trains, computer-controlled trains. So I'm hoping something was mentioned about a tunnel, and I'm hoping that's what they're talking about, because if they're not, they're quietly privatising the Sydney train system by stealth again. They're going to give it to a private company, and it's apparently going to cost them nothing. As I can see, it's going to cost them nothing to get the line from Sydenham to Bankstown, which is our line. And the government's just going to give it to them, which to me isn't right. If you want to give them our line, well, one, you shouldn't be giving them our line in the first place, but two, if you're going to give them our line, we should be getting money for it, not just handing it over.
All right, we're at... Sorry, mate. Hello. We're at about an hour 20 now. Does anyone have any more final questions? You can? What? It's like power in your head.
The only thing I can have discussed tonight is the fact that the work on a new rail line and electrification would create jobs, and that's something that needs to be kept in mind.
That's true, yes. Absolutely. Not just in the rail side of it, but certainly in the community as well. New businesses side and whatever. Oh, sorry. But yes, you're right. It has the ability to create a lot of jobs over time, and you go back to the Central Coast, as I said, it went from probably 60,000 people to 350,000 people, and there's a lot of jobs up there.
So you've got to be pushing those jobs as well at the same time, pushing the rail.
Mind you, you'll be happy to know that your council, Windsor Carriby Council, reckons that they're not going to increase their population by more than about 50% what they have now. And I say fat chance.
Okay, look, I'd like to thank the speaker. Yes, I do, because I've got the memory of a goldfish. Greg, Peter, John and Ben, thanks all for coming.
Thank
you. Now, before we go, Alex has a quick plug. The next Politics in the Pub will be hosting a film by Naomi Klein called This Changes Everything. Tell us about it.
Thanks, Scott. Well, you've actually done all my work for me. I was just going to say I've got some good news and some bad news. So the bad news is that the next Politics in the Pub will put us really close to Christmas. And we don't want that because we all would like a break at some point. So the good news is we're having a movie screening of the film adaptation of Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, which is kind of about how climate change, which is one of the biggest existential crises that we're going to face as a nation, as a planet, and how it could actually be a little bit of a not really a blessing, but there's an opportunity in there to build for the future. So it's going to be held at the Goulburn Club, December the 12th at 7 o'clock. We actually had to license the movie, so we're trying to keep the cost down. The tickets will be $10 each. And we'll be putting more information up on the Politics in the Pub Facebook page. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for turning up tonight. You may have noticed the article in the paper from the last Politics in the Pub. This is all about expressing our citizenship and keeping politicians accountable and actually answering some of the subjects that we do raise through these forums. So I'd just like to thank you all for turning up. This is great. So have a good night.
Hey Alex, where's Alex gone?